Welcome back to Bootstrap 4 by example. In this module, we'll dig into Bootstrap basics. Bootstrap's built-in styling helps you create a consistent look and feel. In this way, it wants you to centralize the look of your application, but also gives you the opportunity to theme or to modify the look while using common classes to change things across the board. It starts with CSS-only metaphors or different objects that can be changed just with CSS classes, and then later on in the course, we'll start to get into components, which can include some JavaScript as well. In this module, we'll be talking about the typography of Bootstrap 4, buttons, navigation elements, lists, tables, and forms. Let's dig into the code. So let's start by looking at typography. If you go back to the project and go to index.html, let's go down to where the logo is shown on our page. Up here we have this tiny little logo which has the styling for a hyperlink, but it's not really what we want it to look like. The reason is this is just a simple old href in the project. Let's wrap this in just an H1. What Bootstrap has done is build a basic typography that sets the sizes of text based on the tags you're going to use. And so just like the default unstyled website uses H1, 2, 3, 4, etc. for different size fonts, Bootstrap is sort of layered on top of that and tried to set some standard sizes for them. So now that we've changed it to an H1, we can see it's now a really big type size. But if we go back and make it something more homogeneous like 4, because remember this is just going to be the header on our page, we can see it's larger so that we can see it, but it's much more manageable size for what a header would be on a page. Eventually these will become the links to individual pages on our site, but we'll get to that a little later. If we come down a little and look at this first paragraph in our main section, if we change this to a class called lead, which is the name of a specific text class for sort of the lead of a main page, we can see that this is now much more readable. It's larger and easier to see than standard text across a Bootstrap page. This is a common approach for doing this. In that same way, if we come back here and change this space is amazing, since the header of our page already says it, let's just eliminate it entirely so that it's not duplicative. Then we can see that we have the space is amazing header, and this just ends up being some of our text. These links here are probably too big for what we really need of them, and we'll fix those a little later as well. Let's go down to the footer for a moment. And we originally had a class called centered that represented centering of this text. But because we removed all of our custom, we'll want to repeat this using Bootstrap semantics. And we can do that by text center. We make that change and save. We can now see that Guitars Are Fun is actually centered. It's a little hard to tell it's centered because this is one very large column, but we have the right-hand sidebar that actually is our total page. So trust me that this is actually centered on the page. And let's do one more thing to explain a little bit more about the typography. If we go back to where we were, see there's the lead text. Let's go ahead and add one more after it. We have another piece of text. Because it doesn't have lead on it, we'll see that is that smaller size. But we also have some other options. Instead of making it lead and larger, we may just want it as something like a subheading. And we can do that by using the text dash modifiers. Now, text center is one way to modify it, but you're also going to have a few that change the color of the text. And the first one I'll show you is text muted. Here we can see it's a little darker than the rest of the site. And again, text muted, because of the theme we're using, everything's really dark. This is just a little darker than this text is. It's a little hard to see here. But if we change this to text primary, we'll see that it's turning back to the primary color of the website. And like colors that we talked about earlier, you have all the options here. You have warning, secondary, danger, and finally success. Follows the same major colors that we're using in our theme. And as you customize your website, changing this color in one place, if you get down to actually editing the Bootstrap build for yourself, you can decide what these colors are really all about. So you've seen how we can change the size, the color, and even the centering of our text. Let's look at what's next. So now let's look at how Bootstrap handles buttons. If you come in here right after the H4, let's go ahead and create just a simple button. And I'll just put in the text of menu there. If we go and look at this, we'll see it's an ordinary button, nothing special about it. By default, Bootstrap doesn't try to style every button that's out there. What you'll have to do is actually use a class, like we've seen many times before. And BTN is the class name that you'll want to assign. And then you'll see it's going to look with rounded corners more like what would fit into our project. This is just a white on black button. So if we come in here, we can also add to this the kind of button we want, like primary, secondary, warning, etc. I'm going to go ahead and put success, so it's a green button. And we can now see we're not only getting it as a green button, but we're seeing some animations that are applied to it as we do the mouse over. What I find interesting is that Bootstrap wants to treat buttons as these stylized pieces, but it also wants to handle links. But if we just change this to an anchor, and I'll just put a dummy href in here for now, we can have the look and feel of the menu, but you'll notice on the bottom that it is still an anchor. Just clicking on this is going to take you somewhere, and this allows you to have buttons that are actually interactable through JavaScript or however you're handling your site, but also have links that might be right next to them that look exactly the same. And the trick here is using those same classes, button and button success. In addition, button has different sizes. So if I went to button LG, you'll see it makes a much larger button. What's interesting is it's following the same semantics. So large, small, they should all work. If we change this to SM for small, we're getting a more compact button. We can also change the button styles here to a new style in Bootstrap 4 that is outline. So if you say button, outline, and then whatever color you're looking for, success and primary and warning, etc. And let's get rid of this button small. We'll just leave it as a regular size button. We can see we're going to get this outline button instead of just the solid color button. And so you can make the decision about what the kind of colors you're really interested in. And you can make a decision about what style of button you want to use. You have all the different colors, but now you also have an outline or a solid button as well. Finally, we can put button block. What button block does is it forces the button to be the full size of whatever container it's in. Because the header here is the whole width of the container itself, we get a button that's that wide. This would be less interesting here and more interesting in some place like this in the sidebar, like having a search button under it that maybe took the entire width of the sidebar. In order to get ready to actually use what we want here, let's get rid of the block, and let's also change this to primary. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to use a Hamburger menu. There's a bunch of ways to do this, but the way I'm going to do it is using an HTML entity. In this case, it's going for the Unicode character for the Hamburger menu, which is 9776. Don't forget that pesky pound sign in there. It's actually and then the pound sign for the Unicode, which is again pound 9776. And then when we're back here, we can actually see we're going to get a Hamburger menu. And this button is going to become the main menu drop-down for when we're on a small site when we start to use nav bars, which we're going to do next. Now let's talk about navs and nav bars. Back in our index.html, we can see this header contains that logo that we worked with a little while ago, as well as what looks like this menu. We can start by going to the header itself and adding a class for nav bar. This is a special class for creating these navigation bars on the top of your website. These can also be used in other places to create a navigation bar-like component in other ways. If we look at it back in the browser, we'll see it has put everything in the nav bar inside the container and also tried to get it to where everything is spaced inline instead of being spaced top to bottom like it was a moment ago. Once you're in a nav bar, there's a bunch of nested classes that are important that you can use. One of the first ones is to take our logo here, and let's actually make it a nav bar brand. This is a special class for specifying a title inside your navigation or your nav bar for the branding of your application. If we come back here, we can see it's a little smaller than it used to be, and then again, it's trying to be centered in this bar that we can't quite see yet. So if we add to the nav bar a nav bar light, that's a class specifying that the nav bar is going to have a light background. And because of this, we can see it's made our text here black. It's a little hard to see on my screen. It's probably really hard to see in the recording, but it has made it dark. The light and dark version of nav bar aren't about changing the background of the nav bar. They're actually for changing the text color for the things on the nav bar. If we change this to dark, we can see here we're now getting the nice light color here that's going to show well on a dark background. To specify the color, we can use that BG-named colors to specify the color. So I could go ahead and say something like primary, and now there's that nav bar showing the primary color from our website. And I can do the same thing for secondary or the other colors as well. Notice because we haven't really made the button and the menu fit into our nav bar correctly, they're not being affected by any of these changes I'm making. Only the actual nav bar brand is showing there so far. And we'll get to changing these in just a moment. The nav bar is really built so that you can specify any color you want for the nav bar. Now, if you're not happy with using one of the BG or the background color classes, you can create your own class, or in this case, I'll just create a style element that says what the background color is going to be. You'll see that by using nav bar light or dark, that's the way you're going to specify what the text color is, but not the actual background. And if I specify the background color, and let's use something like a dark charcoal, we can see that it's going to use that color for our background here. But we could use something like the chooser to really pick any color. And because we're using the nav bar dark for the color we expect the background to be, it's going to make all of the text we're dealing with readable on that background. If we make this something closer to a much lighter color, it's going to be hard to read. But of course, we could then say that our nav bar is going to be light instead, and there it becomes more easy to read. I'm going to specify dark here and then just pick a color that's fairly dark for our nav bar. And that should look good. We're now going to take the div that's around our menu. We're going to add two new classes there. One is called Nav Bar Collapse, and one is called Collapse. Now what this is doing is twofold. It's telling the system that we want the nav bar to be collapsed until we show it. And this is really important that on smaller devices, we don't want to necessarily show the whole menu. We want to use that hamburger menu we created to show it when we need it. But we may want to show the menu on larger devices as well. And we'll get to that in a minute. Before we can make this show, if we actually go and look at this, we'll see that it's made it collapse, which means we can't see it anymore. It's actually not being shown. But we don't have this button doing anything in order to show it. So let's make that work. So if we take this href we have, that button, if we take this anchor, and let's go ahead and make it a button instead, because we don't actually want to link anywhere. And what we'll want to do is add a Nav Bar Toggler. So essentially saying that this is to toggle the nav bar for us, or the menu, more importantly. And we'll need to add two attributes. They both start with data because that is a safe attribute name for frameworks to use. And the first one is going to be toggle collapse. So it's effectively saying I want this button to change the collapse value of what I want to point to. And so this button is going to be actually tied to this div to show and hide it. Even though it's hidden because of the collapse, the button will be able to remove and add that collapse class as it needs to. And the trick there is to use a data target attribute. This data target is going to point at a certain element on the page. And of course, that element is going to be, let me break this out into a couple of lines so we can see it a little better, is going to be this object that we want to collapse or show. And so the trick there is to actually giving our menu, our nav bar collapse piece here, a name. And I'm just going to call it the menu. And then the target value is going to be a CSS selector to that. In that case, it'll be pound the menu. So what is all this little work I've done here? Adding the toggler, adding the data toggle collapse, and the target to point at our menu here. What has that actually done? What it's done is made our menu actually work to show and hide the menu. And this is the experience you're going to get on smaller devices. But by default, the nav bar, the way we have it set up, is set to hide and show the menu as needed. It's maybe what you really want. But for our needs, I want to actually come up back to the nav bar itself. So we're going to put in nav bar, expand, and we're going to say MD. And what the MD is for is to specify at what breakpoint, the medium breakpoint, to expand the menu by default. So if you wanted the menu to actually only by default show on large screens and extra large, we could actually say here and it'll do large and extra large. Or we could do SM if we wanted it on small tablets all the way up to extra large. But I'm going to leave it at medium so we can see what the experience is going to be. Back here in the browser, we can see we now have that menu showing with no toggler button. But as we change the size of the window past medium to small, we'll see that that menu now shows up and has that old experience of when we click it or tap it, we're going to show that menu. And then finally, when we get to the really small size screen, we'll get that as well. So this is going to allow you to make those menus work in the way you want them to. One of the tricks here is that our nav bar is actually inside the container. Remember, the container is going to try to keep it within the boundaries of some centered section. So let's collapse the whole header for a moment. And let's move it outside this container. And we'll see now that same menu is traversing the entire width of the page, regardless of what size we're on. And I actually usually prefer this for the menu to be outside of the width of the website, to be really taking up as much room as we want it to know that we're really owning that space. Again, that same experience of when you hit those breakpoints is still going to work. It's just going to be the entire width of the screen. The last thing we'll talk about is placement of these. I often want the menu itself to be here on the right to sort of balance the page instead of being right here on the left. This is completely up to you, but there are some techniques for doing that. In order to change where the menu items themselves are, we can add a new class to the Nav Bar container here called Justify Content End. Now, this is actually, if you remember, directly from the way we were laying out things with Flexbox. By saying end, we can see it actually show up there. And if we say center, we can see it show up here. So this looks really strange. So we're going to leave it at end. And that's the way, as the menu grows, it'll continue to grow out this way, but always be right justified, and our logo always be left justified. And I think that looks a lot better, especially when you start to look at the different size screens. This won't affect the drop-down menu version. It only affects when the full menu is being shown and not collapsed. Make sense? So now let's talk about lists. If we go to our index.html and just go down into the first story, this first story about stars in the heaven, you'll see this unordered list here. In the browser, it just looks like a very simple list, and that's fine. Often that's all you're going to want. You're not going to want anything more special than that. But you may want to get rid of the bullet points here to sort of imply the list. We can do that by simply saying list unstyled. This will just remove the styling from the bullet points and leave it at a very simple list of objects. It may not be exactly what you want, so let's look at another option. We'll change this to list inline. When we use inline lists, we're going to actually have to use list inline item for each of the list items. It's a little more work involved, but it allows it to really specify what inline list should actually look like. And so we can see that here, it's just a simple, still unordered list like we want it to be, but it ends up being displayed as an inline list instead. And this could be a much larger list of objects or even paragraphs of text or whatever you want them to be. In our case, these are just simple pieces of text. Now, both of those are pretty standard in the way of using things on web pages, but sometimes you need to mimic the look of other things that the user may be used to. Another metaphor is group. If we use group, we'll want to change all these items to group as well. And then in the browser, we can see that we're getting something like an iOS or Android list in a traditional sense, in case you need to mimic that look and feel on a web page or on a mobile page. It even supports making one or more items active so that you can show what it means to be selected. Still getting the interaction with the mouse, but it knows that one is special in relation to the others. We can also come here before one of our items and add a span that is using a class called badge. I'll use badge pill, which is a type of look and feel for the badge. Let's go ahead and add badge secondary to specify how it's going to be colored. I'll go ahead and put 15 in so we can actually see the number 15 in there as if we were giving it a count. And there we can see the badge. And we can put this at the end by putting float right as well. So we get that old style iOS or Android simple list style, which you may need to mimic in your websites here and again. Let's get rid of the badge and the active, since we don't want to actually show those in the design of our application, but we'll go ahead and leave the list group so that our list here shows in this stylized way. Let's look at tables next. So now let's look at tables. If we go back to our browser, we actually have a table that's unformatted here down in our Dwarf Planets and Dwarf Stars section. And by default, we're getting just an HTML version of what that table looks like. Let's see what the markup looks like. If we look at this table, we can see that we have a head section and then some main sections. And the head section is why we were getting rule on how it affects Pluto as bolded. But in order to opt into the Bootstrap look of a table, you're going to need to add the class of table. Again, Bootstrap is going to do very little for the default look and feel of certain objects. You're really going to need to use tables to sort of opt into that. This way, if you have your own styling, it isn't going to just get in the way of that. Now we can see that by making it a Bootstrap table, it's made sure that it fits around, or in this case, under the image. And now we're seeing a much cleaner looking table that isn't so bunched up and is using some lines to effectively say it's a table. Back in the markup, we can add some other table classes to present the kind of table we want. Let's add table striped. And then we'll take our table and make striping on each and every row. You can also do table primary if you want to change what the color of a table is. Let's get rid of that because that's not nearly as useful as you might imagine. We can put table bordered to make sure it has borders around all, not just the column breaks. And even table hover, which shows some interactivity. So as you hover over certain rows, it's going to show you which row you're over. And finally, we can also use table SM for small to get rid of a lot of the spacing for the table for more of a condensed look. You can see we have that same table, but it's much smaller because we've gotten rid of a lot of the padding around the individual pieces. Now you'll notice that this table is sized to the container it's in. That means if we want to change the sizing for this, we can go back to using column values. So let's come here and let's just wrap this with its own div. And then let's use the class here of column, let's say MD6. And then we can get our table to fit into these smaller sections. So you can use the grid system to really size your grids. And the last thing I'll talk about on tables is being able to use a class on the head to be able to specify a different look and feel to the heading for the table. And you can do this with both dark and light. Again, this is going to depend on what your background of your website is, whether it makes any sense. You can see the light is not as effective on this particular website. But I'll go ahead and make it dark so that we have a different header than we have for the rows, and it should allow it to pop just that little more. So now let's see how Bootstrap can affect forms. Here I'm on the contact page, and the rest of the page has been modified to include all of the boilerplate code that was in the first page. So we have the good nav bar and the sizing for the sidebar and the main and our lovely footer down here. That's all been added here. And so we have all the scripts and such that we had on index.cs. But we start with this form that's just using regular normal form elements, and it's pretty ugly. If we come down to this form, we'll see it's just a simple form, labels and inputs, and it's using breaks to cause the different lines to break. And we're going to use something more formal from Bootstrap to help us do that. So let's take this first input as an example. Let's go to the input itself and the label, and we're going to wrap these in a div in something called form group. The idea of the form group is to really put together the things that belong together, like the label and the input in our particular case. And to go along with this, we're going to want to put a class in here of form control. Let's go back and look and see what it's done without us doing a whole lot. So it's taken our label and put it on top of a control that pretty much sizes itself to the container. So here in the markup, we'll also add an ID of the name. And the usefulness of this is not only in having our form variables being sent down, but actually being able to come up here to the label and say for equals the name. And this is important in almost all forms, not just Bootstrap forms, because it allows us to let people click on the label and it will focus the container it's on. So normally, if you just have a label and an input next to it, when someone taps or clicks on the label itself, it doesn't know where to go. But by using that for and the ID, when we click on the name, it takes us to the actual control. And that's the experience we really want. Because of this change, it's really going to make each of these elements into its own block. So we can go ahead and get rid of these forced breaks that are in here. And let's repeat this behavior for each of our controls. And I'm going to go ahead and add the class of form control again, and an ID of the email, and a for the email. That way we have all that functionality together. And because these are both text elements, we can pretty much copy and paste what each of them does. Let's go ahead and do this for the drop-down box as well. Form control. And the select itself will just get a class of form control, just like our inputs did. And I messed this up. This should be form group. Hopefully I caught that in time. And my editor's being a little painful, so I'll fix that and get rid of the break. And we'll want to do the same thing here for focus. ID equals the subject, and for equals the subject. And so we're getting the regular control here for the subject, and then a drop-down that shows each of the options like we want. For text areas, it's not a lot different. Let's go ahead and get rid of that break. And again, like before, we'll do class, form, group, class, form, control. But we'll want to leave the rows equal 4 so it knows how tall to make it. The form control is going to make sure that it's going to be as wide as possible. And then, of course, we're going to do the same thing we've been doing. ID equals the message, 4 equals the message. You can do a tiny little cleanup here. Now we have a big message box as well. We're going to skip the checkbox for just a moment and let's go down to the send button. Now the input here for the send button, we're just going to wrap again in a div that we're going to use the class of form group. So it's no different with the buttons you have on the bottom. And if you have a cancel button here, that would also work. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. But what do we do with this input? Because we can't exactly use the class of form control. The reason is we get a button that then is as wide as the page is. Because that's really what the form control class is doing, is it's making it fit into the container. And you may like this style of send, but I super don't. So instead, even though this is a submit input, I can go ahead and use regular button, let's say success in this case, on this input, and it'll make it look like a regular button that belongs on the rest of our site. We have a nice button here. And of course, someone has overwritten some markup, so let's make sure I fix that. There, that's better. For the most part, this is starting to look like the way we want. And this checkbox still works, but we sure would like it to be a little prettier than it is. And Bootstrap does support that, but it requires us to format this in a certain way. Because what happens in a normal use of a checkbox is that we have the idea of a label that may not have anything in it, and then we have a checkbox that shows that checkbox, and then we might show the text after it. Because if we put the text before it on the label, it's going to show it before the checkbox, and that's even a little weirder. So let's get rid of this break, and let's wrap it in that div like we did before, and we'll do the same thing with class form group, but we super don't want to make this class form control, because then it'll take a checkbox. In fact, let's see what this looks like. Takes our checkbox, there's our text after it, and then this control is the width of the page. Again, just like with the button, we don't really want that. To look the way we really want to requires us to have a little more structure here. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap what's inside the form group, and I'm going to assign this a class of form check. This is a special kind of checkbox, obviously for use in the form, but instead of having a label first, we're going to actually have the label afterwards in order for us to get that look and feel we want with the question after the checkbox. Don't have to put it after, but in our case, it makes more sense. And to make all this work, we then need to add classes to both the input and the label, and it's form check input. And if you're already reading ahead, you probably know where I'm going. Form check label. And that's going to leave us with a very simple checkbox here that's a little stylized. And of course, we still want to give it an ID. I'll call it the requires, and then I'll use, of course, 4 equals the requires. And then we have that experience where they can click on the label as well as the checkbox to check it, which, especially if you think your website's going to be used on mobile devices, makes things a lot easier. But this contact me page is a little ugly. Who's going to need that much space in all of these? The trick there is like any other real part of a Bootstrap site. Let's go ahead and make this container a row. And then on the form itself, let's go ahead and say column medium 6, offset medium 3. In that case, we have a much more manageable size. It doesn't look weird to the user. The last change I'll do to just polish this up, Bootstrap super supports the idea of placeholders. So I'll put your name on that one, your email on that one, and when they come in here, they'll see these ghosted placeholders, and as soon as they start typing, of course, they disappear. So those are some of the ways to make your forms look better. Now we can actually improve this without just centering our form here, and let's do that. Let's get rid of this sizing of our form, and instead, let's take these first 3 items, and let's wrap them in a form row. And what this form row is going to do is put each of these form groups onto the same line in the case of something like a row. Let's get rid of the row we had up here because we no longer need it since we're not going to size by the grid for our form. And we can see we now have our contact page. Our message is taking as much space as we want, but these are sort of bunched up. That's because it's making them sort of a minimal size. The trick here is to just go ahead and say column 4. So use our grid to tell it that we want 3 of these. Again, the grid of 12 divided by 3 is going to be 4 wide. And now we have a form that looks a lot better, taking up the available space, but also using the vertical space to its benefit. So we can see our name and email are probably not going to be longer than these controls, and our subjects we already know aren't going to be that long. And you can mix and match these. So let's make each of these 5 wide and make that 2. Probably not going to look right, but giving ourselves more space here and then having our question answered on the end because it doesn't quite fit. It's not going to exactly be what we want, but it'll be good enough. Let's go back to 4 and let's see what happens to this when we look at it in a smaller browser. Because you're using rows, you're still going to get that experience of how large they must be. And that's mostly because we're using the fixed column sizes. So let's come back here and let's say column empty 4 like we want. But this way we can also say column SM12. And what's that going to do? That's going to tell it when we get small to put these back on their own line. 3 columns there, but then once we get to the smaller form size, we can go ahead and have them take up their own row completely on themselves. So you can have control over, in fact, how that works. Just with the same grid system, but because we're working within the confines of Bootstrap's forms, we can have a little bit more flexibility to how we display these forms without getting into our own special CSS. Let's wrap up this module. So in this Bootstrap's basic module, what have we looked at? I've shown you the first-class support for navigations and lists and tables and forms, but don't be afraid to break out of what Bootstrap is giving you or even amend it or use it as the basis for what you want your applications to look like. Again, if you're worried about your application looking like every other Bootstrap site, there's certainly that concern, but this can get you a long way, especially if you want to leverage what it's trying to do for you. Remember that Bootstrap has a lot of features in it. It has a lot of goodies in the box. You don't have to use each and every one of them through your whole site. Figure out what metaphors you want to use in your website and let Bootstrap help you make the best websites that you want to make. There aren't any rules in the way Bootstrap works, and you certainly don't have to go all in with what you want. If you want to ignore the whole navigation and write your own menuing system, do that. You don't need to buy into Bootstrap 100%. Use it as a set of tools to make your websites better. In the next module, let's take a look at components.